Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of this committee. My name is John Sauer, and I am a constitutional attorney based in St. Louis, Missouri. And today I come to offer my opinion that the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium, and in fact the whole course of conduct that the Federal Department of Education has undertaken in sort of herding and corralling the states into the Common Core aligned curriculum and system of assessments has been unconstitutional under the Compact Clause of the Federal Constitution. It has been undertaken in violation of numerous federal statutes. By way of background, the Compact Clause of the U.S. Constitution provides in Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3, that no state shall, without the consent of Congress, enter into an agreement or compact with another state. The Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium is unquestionably an interstate compact, and it is unquestionably something that Congress has never consented to. It is therefore unconstitutional. In addition to that, it constitutes a shocking, a very surprising course of conduct of federal overreach and federal taking over of state and local control of education that runs counter to hundreds of years of our constitutional tradition, which allocate state and local entities control over public education. I want to go first through a brief history of the regulations that the federal government engaged in order to move, herd, corral, push, coerce the states into the Common Core regime, which is not as well known as some of the other areas in which federal regulations have been challenged. And I want to follow up by highlighting the three specific ways in which this has been in violation of federal statutes and unconstitutional under the federal Constitution. As Dr. Stotsky testified, the Common Core standards were developed by non-governmental entities, but as early as 2009, I think it's quite clear that the current Federal Department of Education made it a priority. It's probably its key priority for this particular administration to engage in a regulatory course of conduct that would effectively substitute the requirements of the No Child Left Behind Act, which, for better or for worse, actually did pass through Congress, were voted on by elected representatives and became the law of the United States, with a regulatory regime that has never been signed off on by Congress or voted on, to my knowledge, by any federally elected official. This decision was made against the background of literally 50 years of federal statutes, ever since the federal entree, so to speak, into the field of education regulation through Congress's power under the Spending Clause. There have been 50 years of federal statutes going back to the General Education Provisions Act of 1965, where Congress has repeatedly, again and again, emphasized that nothing that it authorizes the Federal Department of Education to do should permit that department to engage in, quote, any kind of direction, supervision, or control of curriculum or programs of instruction in state and local education. And very particularly as well, that particular language appears again and again. It was reauthorized by Congress in 2001. It appears in the very enabling act of the Federal Department of Education, which was enacted in 1978. Also, in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, it states that no state shall be required to have academic content or student achievement standards approved or certified by the federal department as a condition of receiving federal funds under the ESDA. And yet that is exactly what we've seen in the past, essentially, 6 years, 5 to 6 year course of conduct by the Federal Department of Education. Confronted with these statutory restrictions, what the federal department has done since 2009 has engaged in a carrot and stick approach with very limited, if any, congressional oversight. First, to sort of lure the states into the Common Core regime before it was as wildly controversial as it is now, and then to impose a series of sticks to threaten the states with very severe sanctions if they come out of that regime. So in the stimulus bill, as it's called, the ARRA of 2009, Congress authorized billions of dollars of supplemental grants to state educational entities. And what the department did, without any reference to this in the statute, is in 2 phases offer a total of billions and billions of dollars to the states, to any state applying who would make a commitment to the Common Core state standards. The phrase in the regulations is a common set of K through 12 standards. You received a very substantial bonus points, additional points on your application for all this money if you made that commitment. And you heard Dr. Stotsky testify that that's exactly what the state of Massachusetts did. #1 in the country, or at the very top of the pack, so to speak. It nevertheless, to get the money, made that commitment. And at that time, I believe 45 or 46 states made a commitment to Common Core in exchange for these federal grants. Specifically, Phase 2 of Race to the Top, which took place in 2010, offered the states hundreds of millions of dollars if they would gather into consortia, which are big groups of states, and all members of the consortia had to commit to the Common Core standards, had to submit their sovereignty over state and local education to the governance structure of the consortium, and they had to commit to using the assessments that would be designed by the consortia using federal dollars over a 5-year period. The state of Missouri, where I'm from, joined the Smarter Balance Assessment Consortium. North Dakota also became a member of that in 2010. In addition to that, another consortium was formed, PARC, which is similar, very similar, and engages in similar work to the Smarter Balance Assessment Consortium. Over 40 states made that commitment as well. And those states took the federal money and started in the process of developing these assessments that are aligned to the Common Core. There are several features of these consortia. If you actually look at the legal documents that a state official signed off on, these documents involve very surprising commitments in many ways. The consortia have elaborate external governance structures with governing boards and executive committees. They have their own staff. They purport to operate outside the sort of open records laws of the various states and the federal government that they're involved in. They involve a binding commitment by the state officials who sign off on them to abide by the decisions of the governing boards on key areas of educational policy which the constitutional tradition allocates to those very states. So there is a ceding of state sovereignty that's involved in the signing of these documents. They also involve a binding commitment to Common Core to use the assessments aligned with Common Core, and they involved, not surprisingly, the substantial involvement of the federal program officers. So the federal government is actively involved in the work of these consortia over the past 4 years as they develop the assessments that are aligned to Common Core. That was in 2009 and 2010, the carrot phase, I might call it, of the whole sort of federal involvement in implementing Common Core and statewide. And I want to emphasize that as the federal government did that, it didn't make a particular, it didn't hide its intentions in doing this. It stated in the Federal Register that the purpose of these consortia is to replace, quote, the existing patchwork of state standards with uniform national standards. And the Smarter Balance Assessment Consortium, when it applied for hundreds of millions of dollars of federal funding to write these standards, in its application it said the purpose of this consortium is to radically reshape the education systems of the participating states. So make no mistake that there was always a radical, far-reaching, federally involved intention in the way that all this was implemented using federal funds. Then in 2011 and 2012, the No Child Left Behind waiver program was implemented by the federal government. This affects North Dakota less directly, but it affects many states very seriously because the Federal Department of Education has made the receipt of the waiver from the requirements of No Child Left Behind, which many states are not in compliance with, has made the receipt of that waiver conditional on a whole series of preset conditions. And within those conditions, key, critical, safe harbors for getting that waiver, which so many states are very eager to get, is commitment to the Common Core state standards and membership in one of the two consortia, Smarter Balance or the PARC consortia. This has functioned in practice as a very severe hammer, a very severe stick, a threat to states to sort of herd and encourage them to remain in these consortia. And it's my personal belief that this has managed to prop up, so to speak, the Common Core state standards for much longer than their natural life should have allowed them to survive. More recently, the federal grants for Race to the Top, the money runs out at the end of 2014. And in order to continue the work of the consortium, Smarter Balance arranged to relocate itself and, in a sense, sort of reinvent itself, but on very, very similar terms, by moving and becoming housed at the University of California. In exchange for that, it asked all member states to sign a new memorandum of understanding and agreement. Missouri signed its in September of 2014. North Dakota signed this memorandum in November of 2014. This memorandum provides for a very serious continuity of regulation, of governance between Smarter Balance as it was housed in the state of Washington and Smarter Balance as it's now housed at the University of California. And the new memorandums of understanding retain the key sort of features of the old ones, specifically the cession of state authority to state and local education remains essentially the same in the new Memorandum of Understanding. In Section 3.1 of that memorandum, the state purports to make a binding commitment to agree to be bound by the decisions of the governing board of the consortium, of which the state is one of less than 20, or of more than 20 members, to agree to be bound on the decisions of the consortium that relate to the relevant areas of state and local educational policy. So by signing this document, a senior state official purported to commit North Dakota, with certain exceptions, to be bound by the decisions of the governing board of the consortium. So this purports to cede North Dakota's constitutionally protected sovereignty over state and local educational policy to the governance structure of this consortium. It also retains the restrictions on withdrawal that were present in the previous Memorandum of Understanding. They're slightly different in the new one, but most importantly, absent a sort of interference by the legislature, which is what I understand this committee is considering here today, the state cannot withdraw for convenience unless within a specific 3-month window each year, it provides at least 9 months advance notice to the consortium. And this sort of restriction on withdrawal is something that the United States Supreme Court has emphasized as one of the key factors or warning signs, red flags, for interstate compacts that require congressional consent under the Compact Clause. There are also potential financial liabilities, annual fees. Missouri's annual fees to this consortium for this year are about $4.3 million. North Dakota's are over $500,000 a year. This course of conduct, not only was it purporting to conduct an end run around 50 years of federal statutes prohibiting this sort of federalization, federal control over state and local education, it also violates the Compact Clause of the United States Constitution. And here I want to return to the 3 points that I referred to at the beginning of my statement. There are 3 ways that the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, has emphasized that are areas of critical concern when it comes to discerning whether an interstate compact like this requires the consent of Congress in order for it to function. And those 3 criteria, so to speak, are whether or not the interstate compact has the potential to threaten the authority of the federal government, whether the interstate compact has the potential to threaten the sovereignty of the member states, and whether the interstate compact has the authority to threaten the sovereignty, the freedom of action of the non-member states. And these consortia, Smarter Balance and PARC, they meet all 3 of these criteria in spades. First, as to the authority of the federal government, it was clearly the stated purpose in the Federal Register that these consortia should conduct an end run around the 50 years of statutory policy enacted by the United States Congress since 1965 against the federalization of curricula and programs of instruction. The very reasons for existence for these consortia is to get around that policy, to replace the existing patchworks of state standards with a uniform national standard. If this is not the sort of interstate compact that threatens the authority of the U.S. Congress that has been enacting these statutes for 50 years, it's hard to imagine a compact that would require congressional consent under the Compact Clause. Second, what threat is there to the sovereignty of the member states, such as North Dakota? Well, again, I think the answer is very clear. First of all, there are contractual commitments made by senior state officials, not made by legislatures, but made by senior state officials, to abide by the decisions of a completely external, non-North Dakota-based, for example, governance structure on key issues of educational policy. For example, if the Smarter Balance Assessment Consortium says, state of North Dakota, you have to give 3 Smarter Ballot tests per year. Your state department has signed a binding commitment that they will abide by that, even if the sense of your voters, your constituents, your educational institutions is. That's a matter of bad policy. That is constitutionally problematic because, again, our constitutional tradition is that state and local educational policy is to be controlled at the state and local level, not at the federal level, and not by some quasi-federal, external, interstate consortium. In addition, there are restrictions on withdrawal. There are contractual commitments that purport to restrict North Dakota's and other states' ability to withdraw from the consortium. And there's also the practical restraint on withdrawal. This doesn't apply as directly to North Dakota, but other states have found it very difficult to withdraw when they realize that there is at least a significant implied and potential threat to their No Child Left Behind waiver. And we saw this unfold over the last summer in the state of Oklahoma, which passed legislation to get out of Common Core, and the federal government a few months later sent them a letter saying we are revoking your No Child Left Behind waiver. This is deeply problematic for reasons that are stated in my written testimony. I believe it is also illegal under federal law. It exceeds the statutory and constitutional authority of the federal department, but it doesn't apply as directly to North Dakota in this case. Finally, how do these consortia threaten the sovereignty of non-member states? In other words, the states who decided, for example, in the beginning, will opt out. Dr. Statsky identified those 4 or 5 states, and then several other states as they come out. The purpose of these consortia is to achieve a national standard, to radically reshape educational systems, to achieve a national standard. If you're one of a small number of opt-out states, imagine the intense pressure that is placed on you to come into line with the sort of critical mass or near monopoly, a cartel of states that are aligned to Common Core. And I think that I couldn't say it better, again, referring again to Dr. Statsky's testimony, you see the alignment of college admissions tests for national colleges, the SAT, standards for the AP tests. If a critical mass of states, if 44 or 45 states are all committed to Common Core, opting out becomes very, very hard. And that's why what this committee is considering today is so important, not just for North Dakota policy, it's important for national policy, national education policy. Because what we see right now is a large movement, a critical mass of states actually opting out. And that undermines the ability of these interstate consortia to serve as they were designed to serve, as sort of monopolistic cartels to put intense pressure on opting out states to come on in as national assessments like the SAT test, like the AP test, become sort of inundated or saturated with Common Core type standards. So the Smarter Balance Assessment Consortium poses at least a potential, and in fact an actual threat, to the authority of the United States Congress. It poses at least a potential, and certainly an actual, threat to the sovereignty of the member states. And it poses at least a potential, and in fact an actual threat to the sovereignty and the freedom of action of non-member states. For these 3 reasons, the Smarter Balance Assessment Consortium meets the criteria that the United States Supreme Court has laid out as the red flags for an interstate agreement that requires congressional consent under the Compact Clause. It is undisputed that Congress never consented to the Smarter Balance Assessment Consortium. It is unconstitutional. And it is my opinion that this committee ought to pass the legislation that's before it, because that legislation takes North Dakota out of this unconstitutional interstate compact and restores North Dakota's traditional and constitutionally protected authority, traditional authority over state and local educational policy. And for all those reasons, I have offered this statement in support of this legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, John Rep.
I have a caveat that certain states went down that road a certain distance and are now backing out. Missouri is one example. Missouri passed legislation in 2014 that's in many ways very similar to the legislation that's before this committee's consideration. Missouri had signed off on Race to the Top, applied for Race to the Top. They didn't get the money in phase 1, but they were part of Smarter Balance and so received the hundreds of millions for phase 2 for the development. But in 2014, Missouri passed a law, House Bill 1490, that allowed the Common Core assessments to be used for 1 more year, but after that requires a a general committee of parents, teachers, state officials and so forth to develop new standards by the 2016-2017 school year.
One more. Mr. Sauer, so in every case, just to clarify, everyone who adopted the Common Core standards also became a member of one or the other of these consortia?
That is my understanding. I may have missed something, but that's my understanding.
Thank you.
That's what happened.
In the beginning, there were about 44 states that were members of either the Smarter Balance or Parkit, or a few that were in both.